should mention a couple things just so that everyone understands my background. I actually was the news editor of the Journal American, not the editor, when I did that series. And yeah, I took that series and basically realized I had a much bigger story once I was done with it, and kept working on it for actually the next almost 10 years doing archival research. So there was a lot of material in the original series that is, or there's a lot of material in Strawberry Days, I should say, that is not in the original series. Particularly the material on Miller Freeman, which is mostly gleaned, in fact, from Freeman's archives, which were at the University of Washington. I understand that it's, someone has told me that one historian went to University of Washington and tried to find the same material in the Freeman archives and found that it had been removed. So, which is a source of some concern. In any regard, yes, I grew up in Southern Idaho, and my background in newspapers was in small papers in Idaho and in Montana before I came out to work in first Kent and then Bellevue. And I currently live in Seattle, although I'm hiding out at my house in Friday Harbor. But the story is, as I think you'll see, is very compelling. You'll see why I stuck with it, because it's actually a pretty amazing story of resilience. It's the best way I can describe the Nikkei community. So I'm going to switch to my share screen here, and we'll start the slideshow. Just a minute here. There we go. All right. So there's the cover for Strawberry Days. I'm not quite sure why they chose this shot, by the way. This is a photo from the Manzanar camp, which my book only kind of peripherally mentions. Most of the people from Bellevue and Seattle were interned or kept at camps in Tule Lake and Minnesota. But it's a beautiful Ansel Adams shot, so I couldn't complain. And the original subtitle, by the way, was The Rise and Fall of a Japanese American Community, which I still prefer for this book, but you know, publishers are publishers and they take charge of these things. So really the start of the story and the essence of the story is what became of these folks. This is actually the Kanonemoto farm, which was located pretty near to the Mercer Island Flyway, freeway. The family was up there on that bench, and they ran a strawberry farm. They were one of the families that was actually able to stay even after the war, because they actually owned their property, and we'll get into explaining all that as we go along. But I loved this photo because it was just a classic shot of the kinds of folks who were working. Some of these workers came over from Seattle to do day labor for the strawberry farmers. So, and that was also part of the story. And there was always an ongoing relationship between the Bellevue Japanese community and the one in Seattle, partly because there were a lot of family ties. A lot of these farmers all came from the same areas around Hiroshima and southern Japan, and a lot of them knew each other, had family connections from back in Japan. So we'll get to the story of how they got there, which was the railroads. After the Transcontinental Railroad was finished in what, 1876, 1878. There was an immediate an outpouring of agitation among particularly white labor to get rid of all the Chinese laborers that had come over and been part of that railroad. So in 1880, and they passed a law called the Chinese Exclusion Act that forbade any further immigration from China. And indeed, the original immigration laws in the United States only allowed for citizenship for free white men. So it wasn't until the 14th Amendment was passed after the Civil War that there was any possibility for non-whites to become citizens. And the Chinese Exclusion Act basically, it was an attempt to stop the incursion of Chinese into the United States and immigration of Chinese. What happened, though, was that the railroad companies still needed this labor, because the Transcontinental was not the only line that they were building. They were building a number of lines, including those across the northern half of the continent, particularly running from the Pacific Northwest over across through Montana and places like that. And these railroad lines, so in order to build these lines, the railroad companies, since they could no longer Chinese labor, turned to Japan. And the railroad companies specifically recruited workers from rural areas because they believed that these people would make better laborers. They, aimed for people who were second and third sons, people who had no chance of inheriting whatever family estate there was. So these folks were some of the very first immigrants to join up. They also recruited in the sugarcane fields in Hawaii, where there was also already a substantial portion of Japanese immigrant labor working. So they recruited from all over, but they mostly targeted people who had been farmers. The work was rough. Building these railroad lines is rough, and the men were very, very hardy who did this. There was, and they worked in large gangs. And then when their work was done, because they were farmers, they decided to take up farming. I should go back a little bit. Yeah, this was a typical farmer. And so what they would do is they would go to white-owned properties and take out a lease. And the terms of the lease typically were to clear the land and make them habitable. And in return for clearing the land, they would be allowed to farm it for the next 6-7 years, depending on the lease. And so, so a lot of these guys, having come through Seattle on the ships to join the railroad camps, when their railroad work was done, came back to Seattle and to the Seattle area and found that they were one of the best places for them to get this land was over on the east side, because there were all these stump lands over there. Because between 1870 and about 1890, there had been all these timber mills in what was now Bellevue. It was almost all old growth over there, and they just mowed down basically the entire east side over those 20 years. And so by 1890 and 1900, much of what we now think of Bellevue was this big, vast set of tracts of stump lands that were owned by white landowners who really couldn't do anything with them, but the Japanese farmers could turn them into habitable property because these old growth stumps and trees were really hard to take out. So they would typically, a farmer would typically go to work on the property, clear out the stumps using horses and mattocks and dynamite, which it was a dangerous occupation. People got killed using dynamite, and would clear the land, usually in the first year. And then in the subsequent years, they would settle in and start farming. And they would farm these very small tracts, typically between 5 and 10 acres. And they would farm them intensively and grow every kind of produce you could imagine. And then they would harvest this produce when it was fresh and take it to market. Almost all of Bellevue's farmers markets or farmers were markets trucking their produce to over to across the lake to Pike Place Market, which is where they would sell it. And so these are called truck farms, these kinds of small tracts. And that's, truck farms actually existed before there were real, what we think of as trucks. There were truck farms in Europe in the 1990s. But they really became a thing for, this became a way for Japanese farmers to get a way. And they were very acutely aware of the prejudice against them. So they were specifically tried to find niches where they were not really competing with white men. And white farmers at the time were primarily focused on, not on these, it would never do as small a tract as 5 to 10 acres. They were usually looking at, 30 to 50 acres at a bare minimum. And of course, nowadays, 1,000 acres is a fairly, an average tract to farm. So, these, back then they were finding, in the large farms, of course, were produced, not produce, but, wheat and hay and corn and things like this, staple foods, potatoes. So the Japanese were finding ways to fit into the economic system. And one of the interesting cultural aspects of this was that in Japan, baseball had already become a thing. And it was very popular in Japan, even in the 1880s and 90s. So a lot of these guys that came over were actually really good baseball players. And they formed, when they went to work, a lot of these guys, when they got done with the rail lines, instead of farming, would go to work for lumber yards. And these lumber companies would have their own baseball teams that were all Japanese, and they had their own all Japanese leagues, and it was a very popular thing. And this was, these shots were taken from Seattle area baseball teams. So this was another one of the ways that the Japanese immigrants, in many ways, they leveraged baseball as a way of blending in with the rest of the community. And of course, then there was, the main thing was the farms. These farms, like I said, were fairly intensive, intensively cultivated, and almost all of what they produced was fresh produce. This is actually a picture of one of these farms looking over. I don't know if any of y'all have been over in the Medina area, but you're looking down from the top of the ridge in Medina towards Lake Washington on this shot. And so Clyde Hill and Medina and all these places, a lot of them were all just originally stump lands, and they were turned into farms and they became habitable properties. This is one of the farms near, this is what's called Mid Lakes. It's just on the other side of the lake there in Bellevue, around the, what's now the Safeway Distribution Center. And this was a very large tract of multiple Japanese farms, including the Matsuoka farm, which we'll get to. Most of these actually were leased. Most of these farms are leased, but the Matsuokas actually owned their farm. So, And that's another shot. Family life for these folks, they were all, very working class. Many of them were illiterate and had difficulty fitting in to American culture because they had they weren't terribly literate in Japanese. A lot of them weren't terribly literate in Japanese to begin with, and becoming literate in English was even harder for them. So nonetheless, they did their very best to sort of both blend in. You could see the Western clothing that folks adopted, and yet there was also very much a lot of an attempt to maintain Japanese values, particularly familial values and traditional values such as honor and that sort of thing. This is Ed Sugaro's parents. This is the Sugaro folks, and these were their children. The people that I talked to who grew up in this period all said it was, really, it was an idyllic life for these kids. They were poor, but they got to play in the outdoors. They worked hard, but it was a good life for them. This is Mitzi Shiraishi, who is one of my favorite interview subjects. She actually lived over in her family's farm was over in the Factoria area. But they grew strawberries, as you can see, as did everyone in Bellevue. And they tried to, like I say, have a normal life. This is the basketball team. They were coached, but their coach was Mrs. Matsuoka. I'm blanking on her first name right now. And they scandalized, the very old-fashioned members of the immigrant community by wearing rayon stockings for basketball games and showing their legs. This apparently wasn't done, but it was part of how they blended in. And the kids all apparently they had a lot of fun. So this is a fairly typical, this is an old Bellevue High School picture from '36. You can see a couple of Japanese faces in there. The one on the far right is Mitzi Shiraishi, who she was valedictorian that year. And this is maybe even a more typical shot in elementary school in Medina in the late 20s, and you can see, it's half Japanese. And this was actually, I love this photo because, there's a terrific, they have the full scale version of this if you go to Bellevue Historical Society. I believe it's hanging on their walls there. It's really a beautiful photograph. This is the Japanese school when it opened, and if you look at it closely, you can see that it's both Japanese and white faces because the people in the community really did blend in with their neighbors. There was a lot of cooperation and a lot of camaraderie among these folks because they all worked hard and they appreciated each other. But then there was sort of the snake in the Garden of Eden. This gentleman, Miller Freeman. Miller Freeman was a gentleman who was a self-made millionaire, mostly by virtue of these trade magazines that he published out of the Seattle area, particularly Pacific Fisherman, which was had a huge circulation and really was kind of the cornerstone of his publishing empire. And in the late, like 1908, 1909, he decided that he got on basically the warpath, as he described it, with Japanese fishermen using the fishing waters of the Pacific. He actually had enough connections that he was able to alert Theodore Roosevelt, the president at the time, that Japanese were fishing in Alaskan waters, and Roosevelt sent a Coast Guard clipper to shut them down. But this became an obsession with Freeman for the rest of his life. He developed a passionate, basically, desire to rid the West Coast of Japanese immigrants altogether. He felt that they should not be here. And part of this was because he believed in yes, I'm sorry, here's Pacific Fisherman, the cover of it. And he believed in a conspiracy called the Yellow Peril, which originally was aimed at the Chinese, but beginning in the early 1900s, as we saw more Japanese immigrants, became devoted to the Japanese. And basically this theory was that the Japanese emperor intended to eventually invade the West Coast of the United States, and was using all of these immigrants as surreptitious foot soldiers to pave the way, and that when given the secret signal from the emperor, they would turn on their white neighbors and commit acts of sabotage and whatever to help enable the invasion when it occurred. Here's a clipping of Freeman talking about the Yellow Peril, warns people that they're going to have to invade the coast. And this clipping is from 1912. One of the popular books, like I say, this is a very popular theory at the time, and it was promulgated by the Hearst newspapers and a bunch of others. But there was even a book called The Valor of Ignorance that laid out the details of this supposed invasion, which included the speculation that if there was going to be an invasion, it was going to happen in Grays Harbor County in Western Washington, down around Ocean Shores or something like that. And yeah, and he actually was, he promoted this theory, and it was widely circulated in the North local press in Northwest, including, I should add, in Aberdeen and Hoquiam, which, as we'll see, actually has a bearing on what happened later. Beginning in 1919, he decided to step up this anti-Japanese activism. He had formed the Anti-Japanese League of Washington in 1911 and used it as a drum. He pushed, in 1914, California passed a law that was actually done with the help of, passed by legislators who knew Freeman, and apparently may have used language devised by him in devising this legislation. These are called alien land laws, and they forbade property ownership by aliens ineligible for citizenship. And the only real aliens ineligible for citizenship at that time in the United States were from Asia, because there had been a Supreme Court ruling in, I think, 1912 that concluded that Japanese immigrants were not permitted to become naturalized citizens. And so at any rate, so by 1914, California had passed one of these alien land laws, and Freeman, who was a legislator for a number of years, but then became a Republican committeeman and was a very, very influential and powerful man, helped coordinate this legislation. There were attempts to pass it in the Washington legislature in 1916 and in 1918 and again in 1920. But it wasn't until 1920 that it actually passed, and it had to do with this campaign, which began in 1919. He had been appointed to the secretary of the Veterans Commission, which was supposed to help deal with finding employment for returning veterans. And the of course, what Freeman immediately announced was that, well, these Japanese farmers are taking jobs away from these returning veterans. And so if we get rid of them, then these Japanese farmers will have more work. And so this is the front page of the Seattle Star. You see over there on the right-hand side, there's a mug shot of Mr. Freeman. You look at the material closely, and it was like a month-long campaign in the front pages of mainly the Star, but some of the other papers, notably the Seattle Times, also picked it up and helped promote it. And yeah, I think the headline there on the left about White Man's Land kind of tells you exactly what we were looking at here. And the yes, and the fear mongering about the Jap menace. One of the things that had them worked up was what they called picture brides. So in 1908, Theodore, there really was open immigration immigration from Japan between 1900, which is really when the main flood tide through the railroads began. Maybe actually, I think 1898 is when we saw the first ones. But by 1908, there was so much agitation, particularly from the West Coast, that Theodore Roosevelt arranged what they called the Gentleman's Agreement. And this was an agreement to stop all further immigration of male workers from Japan. But the caveat of the Gentleman's Agreement was that, well, these guys could still bring their wives and families over. And if they did a traditional Japanese arranged marriage through the mail, using pictures, this was considered acceptable. And in fact, that was primarily the way that a lot of these bachelor immigrant workers wound up getting wives on the West Coast. They went through a go-between back home in Japan, had an arranged marriage. They exchanged pictures. I have lots of stories from Nisei children who talked about how their parents had stories about the horror of encountering their new spouse for the first time and realizing they looked nothing like their respective photos. But there were a number of I found a number of cases in the Issei community where really once the children were done, these families, the husband and the Issei husband and wife basically went their own separate ways because they couldn't really stand each other. But that's the downside of arranged marriages. At any rate, it freaked the nativists out that they were still getting all these Japanese there. Not only that, they were having kids. Oh my God! So the belief was that the Japanese immigrants were going to be outnumbering the white population on the West Coast in no time at all, thanks to all these picture brides who are swarming here. So that was what they did. You know, they pumped this stuff up, and it worked because and this is also in California too. And I urge all of you to check the language here, because one of the things that I really encountered when going through all the material on this anti-Japanese campaign that took place between 1900 and 24 was the incredible similarity of the rhetoric used here to the rhetoric we now see being used today to describe and discuss Latino immigrants, and particularly in this case, the invasion rhetoric. This was the idea that immigration is an invasion originated in this period partly because of the yellow peril theory, which was the part of which was the idea that the immigrants were actually secret foot soldiers preparing the way for an actual military invasion. So that rhetoric remained very common in nativist circles, and like I say, it's very much with us today. This gentleman, his name is Albert Johnson. He was a publisher and editor in Hoquiam and Aberdeen. And yes, he grew up with this belief in the impending invasion of the West Coast, potentially coming right to his hometown. And he was a congressman. He was elected a congressman from the district that included, actually back at that time, Tacoma. And he was a protege of Miller Freeman's. And Albert Johnson eventually became chairman of the U.S. He dressed up nice. He became chairman of the House Committee on Immigration and was the main author of the 1924 Immigration Act, which was known at the time as the Asian Exclusion Act, because its main accomplishment was to ban Japanese immigrants, ban Japanese immigration. And there was a great deal of agitation going around about this idea. And yes, nativists hated both the Irish and the Chinese and the Asians with equal vigor. At any rate, that bill passed in 1924 is the foundation of our current immigration laws. It set up the first system of racial quotas, and that were predicated mostly on encouraging immigration from Caucasian nations. That aspect of our immigration law did not change until the mid-1960s. And it also basically codified the term illegal alien, because in many ways, these folks didn't see Japanese, they didn't see Asians as being fully human. They didn't see them as being human in the same way that they are. They saw them as describing their propaganda frequently as being insect-like and innately lacking a kind of moral component of their characters. And this was fairly typical. But at any rate, they passed this law and it banned all further immigration from Japan beginning in 24. There were riots in Tokyo. Of course, these fellows looked pretty cheerful, but apparently there was a lot of damage done from people who were, outraged and at their treatment by Americans. And indeed, at the time, there was a nascent pro-democracy movement in Japan that was contending with, more rightist components of the political scene, particularly the militarists and the people who ran the Japanese military. And the democracy movement died in Japan in 1924, thanks to the passage of that act. The country's politics were, the militarists took control of the nation's politics. Japan embarked on a bellicose anti-American agenda for the next 16 years, and it all culminated in the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. In the meantime, there was just life in Bellevue. So the strawberry farms are really incredibly popular. uh, and it was actually the main crop for most of these farmers. They grew all kinds of crops. They grew peas and lettuce and all kinds of fresh produce. But their real cash crop was strawberries, because they grew lots of them and they grew them well. And I guess they were really good because they were incredibly popular. And it became, so in about 1926, I think it was, they started up the first strawberry festival. And they had a parade. And yeah, here's another clipping from it. People would get on the ferry over at Leschi, or not Leschi, I'm sorry. They're on Lake Washington, and come over to Bellevue on the ferry and spend a whole day coming over and eating strawberries and shortcake at the festival. And it was a very popular thing to do. And it was people coming to this, what was in most times a village of a few hundred, because at that time, Bellevue was the most remote point on the lake from Seattle proper. You had to drive around either the north or south end of the lake to get to it. And because they were, I should mention also that the Bellevue Strawberry Queens were always white girls. They never seemed to include Japanese girls in the competition. But they certainly ate strawberries in large numbers. And I think the community was satisfied with that. So by the mid-1930s, these Japanese farmers were really starting to prosper. And one of the things, I mean, the farms not only were selling lots and lots of produce over in Seattle, but the farmers got together and built this warehouse. It's called the Bellevue Vegetable Growers Association. It's this building is still standing, by the way. It's over there next to the railroad tracks, just north of the main entrance to 405, there off Main Street in Bellevue. And it's part of another business, and it's had stuff built onto it, but you can still see the structure. This is where the farmers would bring all their produce, and being next to railroad tracks, they'd load up, they had rail cars that they would load up with their produce and send it all over the country. And here's one of the labels from their produce. And they were selling this stuff in, Chicago and New York and across the Midwest. But while they were prospering, at the same time, there was people who had a sort of different vision of Bellevue than being just a farming community remote from Seattle on the lake. And one of them was Miller Freeman. Freeman had bought a mansion in Medina, by the way, in the I think 1922, and quickly became, one of the most influential men on the East Side. And he began work on, had this vision, he had somebody draw a map up for him. And that's what you're looking at here, of building a bridge across Mercer Island and using it to connect up with what was then called the Sunset Highway. And that became Interstate 90 now. And, then he set about making it a reality. And indeed, he was one of the people who convinced, or actually sponsored and got behind, Homer Hadley, who was the state engineer who first suggested building a floating bridge. This idea was widely mocked at the time, and especially in papers like the Seattle Times. And because Freeman got behind Hadley, they actually, it put a little bit of political heft behind it. And after a while, it got built. And Freeman was the guy who pulled a lot of the strings to get it built. So there's the opening of it in 1940. And then in December 1941, we had this, and everything changed. Because even though Bellevue at the time was, had this bridge across to it, a lot of the property was occupied by Japanese farmers. But as it happened, these Japanese farmers didn't really own the property. Most of them had to lease because of the alien land law that Miller Freeman had successfully had passed in Washington State in 1921. And so there were a lot of people living on these lands that it was going to be actually pretty simple to get them off. All you had to do was start agitating for, putting this area. And indeed, in the Seattle press, there was endless hysteria about exactly the scenario envisioned by the Yellow Peril, which was that these Japanese immigrants were committing acts of sabotage that were going to help guide incoming planes and that sort of thing. A lot of these were actually generated down in San Francisco by the people in command of the U.S. military on the West Coast, particularly Lieutenant General DeWitt, who was really as we'll see, was primarily the person responsible for making the decisions that created the incarceration of 110,000 people. But at any rate, the hysteria was pitched up, and there were, these kinds of fairly bigoted cartoons floating around. This is from the Seattle PI. And lovely ads that, engaged in stereotypes, as well as straight up AP news stories claiming that the Japanese were planning to sabotage things. So with this agitation going on, and with the Western Command saying that there needed to be an evacuation of the West Coast, on February 19th, 1942, FDR signed Executive Order 9066, which allowed for the military to round up and incarcerate persons deemed security risks. And the people who fit this category, as it happened, were all persons of Japanese descent, according to Lieutenant General DeWitt. And so they started holding congressional hearings, mostly on the West Coast. These are called Tolan Committee hearings. And they held one in Seattle. And of course, Miller Freeman was the guy who came and spoke to that. And he, of course, you see the resulting headline there. And of course, the reality was that the decision had really already been made, even at the time they held these hearings. One of the other things that Miller Freeman did, I should mention, is he held a series of meetings in Bellevue in which he ordered Bellevue community leaders to actually come to, I think it was actually a community hall, and listen to him lecture them about how they were going to be getting, as one of the attendees described it, the shit end of the stick from their neighbors from henceforth, and they just had to settle down and like it. and, um, and I have as it happened, he was so proud of these sessions that he had his secretary keep minutes of them, and I encountered, came across those minutes when I was going through his archives. And it was really a rather astonishing, kind of ballsy thing on his part. But several of the Nisei folks that I interviewed were at this meeting and remembered it very vividly because it was one of their main memories of Miller Freeman. And all I can say is I would urge you to go read the piece I wrote for Daily Kos about all this, because it has the full contents of that session. It was really kind of appalling. All we know is that even as these hearings were going on, the decision had already been made to evacuate all people of Japanese descent from the West Coast. And so in April, there was a dry run, a test run done with the residents of Bainbridge Island, who were rounded up and given tags, and put on a boat or put on a ferry, and then taken across to Seattle, and then put on a train that took them to what became Manzanar, the camp at Manzanar. And that was actually the very first of the internment camps, and it was kind of a test to see if it would work. And it did. So they proceeded at pace. And by May, people in Bellevue were getting their notices that they were going to be shipped out. And most of the, let's see, I had another clipping, but I didn't include it here. I'm sorry. So about 2 weeks after this story ran, they actually all met at the train depot in Kirkland, and were put on board. But there were 60, we're not sure, it might have been 62, maybe 63 families put on board, and shipped out, and most of them never returned. They were taken to Tule Lake in Northern California, because that was one of the, they had two steps in the internment process. One was what they called assembly centers, where they would just, got people completely out of the area altogether because they hadn't finished building what they called the relocation centers. And the relocation centers were the actual concentration camps. And these were all being built in the interior in places like Idaho and Arizona and elsewhere. Most of the immediate assembly centers were still on the West Coast. But Tule Lake was also one of the, so I'm sorry, they actually first went to Fresno, and that was where their assembly center was. And they spent about 2 months of that summer baking in the heat in Fresno, and then about 2 months later, the camp in Tule Lake was finished, and they were all taken up there. Now, as it happened, most of the immigrants from the Seattle area, most of the Japanese from the Seattle area, were not taken to Tule Lake. They were taken to Minidoka in southern Idaho. And so there was a process about a year into the whole internment where internees were permitted to transfer. And many, many of the Bellevue folks transferred out of Tule Lake and up to Minidoka, in no small part because Tule Lake was huge, and it was turning into, there was a lot of unrest, a lot of political unrest. It was turning into really kind of an ugly scene there. So a lot of these farmers wanted to get away from that. And one of the ways you could do this was by doing farm work outside of the camps in places where they were having a labor shortage, particularly sugar beet farms. There's a huge sugar beet labor shortage because of the war. And so in places like Montana and Utah and Wyoming and Idaho, you could get out of the camps and go to work at a supervised farm, sugar beet farm typically. This is a photo of Tom Matsuoka. He's there right in the middle, kind of leaning on the fender of the car with the hat on, with his crew that he got out of the camp at Minidoka. And they all retired to Montana for the duration of the war. And there is Mrs. Matsuoka keeping things clean in the little shack that they had to live in on the Sepp Blatter farm there in northern Montana. Another way of getting out of the camps eventually was military service. Initially, even men who were in the military at the time were required to report and to the deportation facilities. And so a number of these guys were actually military guys who were actually already enrolled in the army and had to go live in these camps. So many of them were eager to get out. There was a huge discussion, a huge debate. Really, it was a giant controversy within the camps over a loyalty questionnaire that the camp administration distributed to all male members or all male internees, 18 and over, asking for whether they were loyal or not to the United States. And, you know, if you signed it and affirmed your loyalty, there was, you know, you had two boxes, yes, yes, to sign. And the idea was to open the way for using these internees as, you know, people, you know, soldiers in the military. So putting them into service. So, but it created a huge controversy because, of course, a lot of people, somewhat naturally, felt that it was insulting to ask about their, you know, their loyalty as Americans. And this wasn't something that a white person would have to sign in order to be drafted into the military. So there were a lot of young males within the camps who checked their boxes off no and no. They became known as the no-no boys. And it was part of, I was mentioning the political controversy and disruption going on in the camps in Tule Lake. That wasn't the only camp that had issues over this whole, or, you know, they had riots in some of these camps over this whole issue, including in Manzanar, including Tule Lake, and most infamously, I think, in Heart Mountain, Wyoming. But at any rate, there were a number of guys from the Bellevue community who were very eager to get back or to join the military, including a couple of them, notably Joe Matsuzawa, who had already been enrolled in the service before the evacuation orders were issued. So these guys all joined up and they were put into an all Japanese unit called the 442. By the end of the war, it was the most decorated unit of soldiers in the entire war. These guys were brave and incredibly capable, but they also were, let's be honest, they were sent into situations that were frankly meat grinders, and in which they were going to almost certainly endure very large casualties, but they were considered expendable because they were Japanese. Nonetheless, this sacrifice that they made was really fundamental to changing public attitudes about the Japanese after the war. So some of the guys who were in the 442, the little fellow on the left underneath the Holiday Inn sign is Kim Muramoto, who you'll meet in a little bit, was one of my internees. Kim was the owner of Bellevue Nursery for many, many years and ran that shop until he retired later. And the Muramoto family had that nursery going before the war and after as well. Here's a shot of Kim somewhere in that crowd of them pulling up to the dock in Italy, which is where many of these guys saw action. Here's just a nice shot of them capturing, I don't know who these guys are, but it was just a nice shot of Nisei soldiers capturing German soldiers, most of whom were pretty young, as you can see, because these fellows were getting into the war in, early 1944, and the war was nearing its end at this point. Here are a couple of my interviewees, by the way. This is Kiyo Yabuki, who was a postman there in Bellevue for many years. Kiyo is a very sweet guy, very soft-spoken. He was wounded and spent, he lost use of his legs for a couple of years, but got out and became a postman. So he had good use of his legs by the time he was elderly. Here is Kim Muramoto, who I mentioned earlier, and Kim is Kim in his later years. The fellow on the left is sorry, I was going to say Ibuki. Actually, the guy on the right, I'm sorry, is Masinatsu. And Masinatsu was one of the people who died. He was a very popular guy from Bellevue, and he died in France. In spite of this sacrifice, by late 1944, there had already been a court ruling, Supreme Court ruling on that basically emptied the camps. It's called Endo v. I'm brain cramping again, but at any rate, it was a key ruling that basically said, yeah, we can't hold citizens against their will. So they began closing up camps. And when they did so, there was a huge campaign to try to prevent them from returning to the West Coast, stirred up by the same nativists who wanted them out of the area in the first place. This fellow here is the mayor of Kent at the time. There was a large Japanese community in the White River area, and these guys didn't want them coming back to Kent either. That picture ran in Time magazine, by the way. There was a lot of really ugly talk that went around, including, this sign down in the Rose Hill area. And it spread to Bellevue as well, because there was an actual meeting, a public meeting held featuring this pamphlet. This guy, Lambert Schuyler, actually lived on Bainbridge Island, but this pamphlet he published was circulated widely by these folks who were trying to keep the Japanese from coming back. By the way, their solution was to find a remote uninhabited island in the Pacific somewhere and put them all there. So, yeah, 110,000 people on a remote Pacific atoll. That's going to work. Anyway, there was a meeting in Bellevue in which they actually were giving away busts of General MacArthur, who they called the #1 Jap fighter. These guys are real charlatans, and they held this public meeting. And as it turned out, most of the people in Bellevue showed up to it who heckled them. They were heckled off the stage, driven out of the town, not by force, but just harangued and told to just leave by people who remembered their Japanese neighbors and didn't want anything to do with this. And indeed, there were a number of folks who were able to come back and start their lives up again because their neighbors had actually kept their farmers going. Mitzi Soraisi's family was an example of this. But at the same time, it was, only because of the alien land laws, only 15 of those 60 families actually owned their property. And none of the people who were leasing farms found that that was an option for them when they came back from the war. The only people who were actually able to come back to Bellevue were those who owned their land, and not even all of those who did. Tom Matsuoka, for instance, was one of them. And Tom came back and found that his house had been burned down and all of its contents. So realizing that he was going to have to start over from scratch anyway, and I expect being disgusted by this kind of ugliness in Bellevue, he chose to sell the land and stay in Montana. And he indeed continued to remain, he bought a farm with his proceeds from his Bellevue property, bought a sugar beet farm and farmed it for the next 40 years. He was Montana Farmer of the Year in 1962. And then when he retired, he finally came back out to Western Washington to be near his daughter, Ray Takakawa, who by then was living in Vancouver, Washington. So that was, and I interviewed Tom at his home there in Ridgefield. At any rate, back to our photo here. This is of Mr. Freeman. Yes, just as an indication of just how powerful he was. When they paid the final toll on the Mercer Island Bridge in, I think, 1952, he was the one who was honored to do that final toll, and because everyone recognized that he was the guy who got the bridge built. And Freeman was indeed a dynamic man. I mean, part of his anti-Japanese agitation led him down these paths, such as he formed this Washington State in 1912 as part of his effort to keep the Japanese fishermen out of their waters. Well, that naval militia really did become, a real thing. He was the commodore of this militia. They basically just had one boat at the time, but it still lives on today because, I mean, he was recognized by the National Oceanographic Administration. That he was honored in 1975. They christened one of their major vessels the Miller Freeman, and I knew a number of scientists who served on that boat had no idea what the background of the man was, because even though he was one of the most powerful and influential men in the country at the time, his legacy faded into obscurity in no small part because it was just marred throughout by this incessant agitation against the Japanese. I mean, Freeman's favorite line when he talked about the Japanese, and particularly why he wanted them, he said, "Well, I hold nothing against them, but oil and water do not mix." And his belief was that Asian people were so fundamentally different from white people that they would never be able to blend into a society. And of course, I think history has proved him wrong as can be. But so just to quickly sort of wrap up, I do want to kind of talk about some of the folks I interviewed. And so this was Tom Matsuoka at his home in Ridgefield. He was 92, I think, at the time I took this photo. And he died 3 years later, I think. he just a lovely man. I did have a lot of difficulty understanding him because he had a very heavy accent. Well, the reason for that was that Tom was actually born in the United States. His father had been one of the early laborers working in Hawaii in the sugarcane fields. And Tom was born in Sprecklesville, Maui. And but when he was 2 years old, his mother fell ill, and so they shipped her back to the family in Japan, and Tom went with her. And Tom was actually raised in Japan and went to Japanese schools, spoke Japanese fluently. And then when he came of age at age 16, he decided he since he had no, inheritance coming, that he was going to go join his father in the United States. And he did at the age of 16. So he was an American citizen because he had been born in the United States, but was actually in many ways just very much a typical Issei, in that he was, very immured in Japanese culture. And he became an important figure for the people in Bellevue because at the time that in the 1920s, when most of the Nisei folks that I interviewed were 1920s and 30s, when they were children and teenagers, Tom was an adult. And he was leaders, Nisei folks. Like I mentioned, his wife, who was the valedictorian of Bellevue High School when she graduated, was also coach of the girls' basketball team, and Tom coached the baseball teams. I guess he was a hell of a catcher. Supposedly, he was a very skilled baseball player himself. But anyway, he was really an important figure in the life of Bellevue. And when he was fundamentally stripped out of the community, I think Bellevue as a community itself lost just this tremendous resource of leadership and his presence. He was a really important man, and they lost him. Couple more of the folks. Here's on the left is Joe Matsuzawa, who I mentioned was in the 442. And Joe's son, John, by the way, is a cameraman for Como 4 News. And you'll see him. I saw John at the Bellevue College gathering in just before the pandemic hit. It was still March, wasn't it? Yeah, I think it was early March. John was there covering that. So, but Joe passed away a few years ago. Joe, as it happened, was one of these guys who because he got leave, military leave, before anybody got out of the camps. And so he came back to Bellevue very early, and he went to the old Bellevue Vegetable Growers Association, and found that it had been completely abandoned. The white company that was supposed to take it over during the war just flopped within a matter of a month or two. And he found this box of records of the files from this company that tried to run the warehouse after the internment. And so I had their whole records. And if you read Strawberry Days, you'll see that I tell the story of how, whites said, "Oh, we can run these farms. This is just a matter of white ingenuity. We don't need these Japanese. We can ship them off and no problem." And so they started up. There was a company that was, as near as I could tell, run by very sketchy characters that started up, attempted to do harvests in midsummer, and couldn't get anybody to come over and help harvest strawberries or lettuce. And so within about a month or two of operating, they just basically shut down. The farmers who had signed leases with them to run their farms saw no money at all during the course of the war. Most of these farms lay fallow during the course of the war, and everybody lost. So at any rate, Joe was the guy who snagged those records for me and got them in my hands. Those records are now available. You can find them at Densho because copies of them turned them over to the folks at Densho, which is the great memory project devoted to the Nikkei community over in Seattle. Gentleman on the right was a real character. His name's Akira Aramaki, and he was the guy who was at the meeting. One of the guys that was at the meeting with Miller Freeman, and Akira was not shy about divulging his opinion of Miller Freeman. He had a you know, if I mentioned Freeman's name, he would growl. Fellow lady on the left is Mitzi Shiraishi. You remember her holding the basket of strawberries. The gentleman on the right was one of my, he was, gosh, sorry, I have to get his name right. Sorry, this is Tok Hirataka. And Tok was actually really central to me being able to talk to a lot of these folks, because what he would do is every time I would try to do an interview with Tok, I would show up with my recorder and he'd have 10 other people there to talk to me. And Tok would give me like 3 words, right? I finally was able to just get an interview with him after about a year of trying, but he was one of these gentlemen who was quiet, quite spoken, but he had very firm feelings about what had happened to them as well. The Hiratakas also had, they actually came back to Bellevue. Tok was a citizen who had gotten the property put in his name. And so, and they own most of that, there's that whole strip of car dealerships just off of, I think, Maine, on the east side of 405. And that was where their farm was. This is Ray Takakawa, who is Tom's daughter, Tom's oldest daughter. Ray was also a Bellevue High School valedictorian in 1940. And she described to me, you know, the extraordinary heartbreak that I think most of these young people felt, because most of these guys, like I say, were teenagers at the time that this happened. And they had always seen themselves as American. And they couldn't understand why they weren't seen as American by their fellow Americans. And Ray set me up with much of the interviews with Tom, as well as many others, and just a lovely person. She passed away just a couple of years after Tom did. But anyway, and this is Tom's son, Ty. If you remember that shot next to the Bellevue Vegetable Growers Association warehouse, well, that was Tom Matsuoka standing next to that car. And this guy, Ty, was one of those 2 little boys. And he lives there in Bellevue to this day. Lovely man. Very genial. And 2 more. Now, Ed Suguro is also still with us. Ed was he was part of the Suguro family. He does a lot of work with the Wing Location Museum. And then the gentleman on the right was Tosh Ito. Tosh was also really a major figure for a lot of the folks in the community. And some of you may know his daughter, Alice Ito, who to this day remains very active in the Bellevue Nikkei community. This is Al Yabuki, who is one of my 442 veterans on the left. And Al was very kind enough to drive around with me and show me all the sites, or let me do the driving, and he would tell me where to go for the sites for the farm, and describe to me what these farms were and whose they were. The lady on the right was Rose Matsushita. Rose was also, and she was actually a Yabuki. She was Al's sister. But really a lovely person, lived there in Bellevue, and her interview is actually pretty difficult because it was still obvious that there was a lot of heartbreak there for her that even existed in 1992. And this lady is Mitzi Kawaguchi. She worked in Bellevue School District in the food service for many, many years, and is very well known, very beloved in the Bellevue area. She passed away, I think, 4 or 5 years ago. This is Tom Matsuoka's brother, John, who actually continued to farm that tract down by Phantom Lake up through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, which is when I took this picture of him. But I think John passed away a couple of years ago as well. So that's the story. Most of I think that the thing, one of the main conclusions that I drew out of it certainly was that, these kinds of foundations can get erased within a community with incredible ease. And I think it's really important to understand where we come from, particularly for those of us who, benefit from the hard work and sacrifice and pain that these folks had to endure. And a lot of it had to do with a man who didn't see them as human. And, I think that's where a lot of the world's miseries begin, is that we don't see each other as human. I advocate a politics of empathy and kindness, and I think that, a lot of the things that we have to correct and fix even today were caused by this kind of institutionalized white supremacy. When I think of, so one of the things I did, over the last decade was I worked for the Southern Poverty Law Center from 2013 to 2019. And I'm currently a staff writer at the Daily Coast, but working for the SPLC, and a lot of my reporting has to do with white supremacists and hate groups and that sort of thing. But when I would talk to people about, how we overcome bigotry, one of the underlying subjects is always institutionalized white supremacy. And it's hard to explain to people. And one of the reasons I really always go back to this story is that if you want a picture of institutionalized white supremacy and how it worked, you look at Miller Freeman, because he was the institution that founded Bellevue. And yet underlying it was this belief that, they were basically, he tried to create Bellevue as an all-white community. And there were, in fact, covenants in many neighborhoods, racial covenants that forbade sale of the homes to Jews and non-whites for many, many years. They finally got outlawed and eradicated, but this was part of how Bellevue was founded. And it's in our bones. So if we recognize that it's in our bones, then it is something that, we understand that it has a corrosive effect even today. And it's something that people of good conscience will, I believe, work hard to try to overcome. So I'm hoping that, in Bellevue, there's a discussion of this fact, of this history, because, I think it's a community that wants to overcome this as well. So let me get off of the share, and we'll just go back, and I'll be happy to answer questions now. Do you want to, Jordana, oversee this? Yeah. Oh, that's right. I need to unmute you, don't I? There we go. And then can you take over as master and commander now?
Let me see. No, I think you have to transfer it to me.
Okay. And where do I,
Let me
this is
see.
manage participants.
Yeah.
There we
You
go.
just click on my name.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can reclaim host. Yep, here, reclaimed host, the host again.
There you go. Okay.
Okay, so we had a format that we thought of people sending questions to us, but I think that to make it more dynamic, maybe we can just unmute everyone and have, let me see. That's a little too loud. Let me see. What I'll do. Mute all. Yes. So there's a, I think you can raise your hands. Let me see if we can do that. If anybody has a question, they can raise their hand, or let me see if it will show up. So I'll just allow, if you have a question, you can just unmute yourself and then you can ask any question you want.
So I'm unmuted. Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Go ahead.
What I'm curious about is how Miller Freeman was involved then in getting all of the land that he acquired to then donate it to the Bellevue College development.
Let me see. I think, oh, I'll have to unmute it, David, just a second. Here. David, you're on mute. Yeah, I unmuted you. I'm sorry.
Quite all right. He was a land developer in addition to everything else. I mean, yeah, he made his first millions in publishing, but then made his most of his actual wealth, his ensuing wealth, as a speculator and developer. He owned a lot of property, obviously, including Bellevue Square. He was, they founded Bellevue Square and developed it, and as well as purchased up a lot of that property. Now, I don't know if Kemper got that Bellevue property, the Bellevue College property, as an inheritance. I am not sure if Miller was the original owner of that. Kemper has been the main guy. I mean, Kemper Jr. Was one of the main guys in expanding the empire through real estate. And so, yeah, all those downtown buildings that Kemper Jr. owns and things like that, that's just all Kemper. And, there's, I always tried to put some separation between Kemper Jr. as well as Kemper Sr. and their father and the old man, because my understanding was that Kemper Sr., definitely did not approve of his father's attitudes about the Japanese. He went out on the day after Pearl Harbor. He was superintendent of the school district at the time. Kemper Sr. was. On the day after Pearl Harbor, there were reports, and were accurate, that there was a bus driver in the Bellevue School District who was refusing to pick up Japanese kids. So Kemper Sr. got in his car and drove around and picked those kids up himself. So, yeah, very different. And it's why, we have to be careful about, assigning the sins of the fathers to the sons, because I don't know that, I mean, the point of all this discussion really is that we all have a legacy. White people have a legacy of, we all started on third base and thought we hit a triple, and we need to understand how we actually got to third base. We need to understand that we got there on the backs of people who engaged in, or got there through the help of, our forefathers who engaged in discriminatory and really racially bigoted acts. And we can't fix that now in terms of going back and changing what happened in the past. But what we can do, and what we must do, is fix things now. We need to make a good faith effort to look reality in the face, look at what we've done in the face, acknowledge it, own it, and then work to rectify its effects as much as we can, ameliorate those effects. Because those effects remain with us today. The demographic balkanization of racial groups in America that, you know, Bellevue was, you know, the foundations of Bellevue were part of, is something that we still are dealing with. I mean, in Ferguson and all of these other places. And until we deal with them, I don't think we're actually going to be able to, until we deal with them honestly and look at them forthrightly and deal with the victims of them in a way that has integrity, I think these problems are just going to keep happening and happening and happening.
But the property itself, was any of that Japanese farms?
I may have been, you know, one of the really large tracts is very near the Bellevue College campus. It's the when it was called Peterson Hill tract, and it's now the Country Club. Yeah, that was a huge Japanese farm tract. What's now Bellevue Country Club. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Were you able to talk to any of the Freeman family, of anybody at all? Did anybody speak to you?
No. So working at the JA, right, I should have been able to talk to Kemper, but my friend Monty Enbisk, who was business editor back then, talked to Kemper all the damn time, right? Because Kemper was one of his main sources, and he tried to help me arrange an interview. Kemper just flat turned it down, and I tried a couple of other times. I tried back, so I tried again in 2005, just before Strawberry Days came out, or before I wrapped up the manuscript on it. And I tried, made 2 more attempts, and I actually just got no response. So, and I just wanted to, I thought it would be an interesting conversation. I'm sure he's thought about it, you know, but instead of dealing with it forthrightly, we've just been shut down. We've had things shut. And I've actually, this situation with Bellevue College is not the first time it's happened. There have been other artists who've had their work in Bellevue get censored previously because they tried to bring up this whole episode with the strawberry farms and the anti-Japanese prejudice that was really pervasive at the time. And yeah, so this isn't the first time this has happened.
Thank you.
You bet.
So G. Harvey, you raised your hand, you can go.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the positives as an African-American male, one of the positives that has come out of this whole thing is, you know, where whomever wanted to silence, it actually created more publicity and awareness, because
Absolutely.
I definitely didn't know anything about it. And, you know, I work remotely, so I'm not on campus at all anymore. And so it led me to dig. I read the article prior to today, and it was just enlightening. And your presentation just was excellent. And the reading was just, you know, the foundation to what you were saying. My hope is that, and I think I'm not the only one, I'm just very curious as to if they will reveal in their final analysis or investigation the why. If they can connect those dots, that will help me move on, because I'm just curious. Is it because of the large donations to Bellevue? And, you know, but I just want to know if they could get to the why of why that was done.
Yeah, I can't speculate on that because I'm just not privy to how those decisions were made and what went on. I do know that, I mean, the vice president who got fired, who did this, was African American. So I mean, it's really easy to see, you know, a white suburban housewife pulling that thing down, and because that's kind of the stereotype. But when it's, you know, someone who you would think would be sensitive to issues of white supremacy doing it, it's just, what it really underscores is, I mean, it was a very teachable moment, and I think for everybody involved, because even people of color can reflexively deflect to the sort of nature of institutionalized white supremacy, because we don't even know. I don't think she knew before she pulled it down what this history was. Certainly, I don't think she had any understanding that, no, not only was Miller Freeman involved, he was the guy. He was the leader. He was, I mean, not just in Western Washington, but up and down the whole West Coast.
Thank you, David.
You
Does
bet.
anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Kayla.
Oh, hi. I have a question about possible reparations. Obviously, our college has accepted a large amount of money from the Freeman family. And obviously, the Freeman family has silenced people repeatedly and will continue to do so. What's a way to break this cycle and perhaps give the money back so at least our college can be free of this?
From my understanding, like, I don't think that they actually donated a lot of money in the past years. So I think that that question also might be directed to Bellevue's future interim president. Maybe he would be the best person to ask that. But I don't know if David has any idea, like, of what we could
You
do.
know, I'm not in a really good position to speculate on that. You know, obviously there was already reparations out to people who were victimized that were handed out in the 1980s. But even so, I don't think that those reparations were frankly inadequate, and particularly what people lost. I just don't know what, honestly, you can do to, most of these things this is water long under the bridge. I think the more important thing is for Bellevue College to take a leadership role in confronting and dealing with these kinds of this matter in a forthright fashion. And I think it's actually really well positioned to do so. You know, very impressive lineup, I've got to say, of presidential candidates. It's like, wow, because I remember when it was Bellevue Community College, you know, just that tiny little campus over there on the east side. But then I was working in the 90s, so.
Yeah, and I would just like to take a minute also to thank Acting President Kristen Jones, because she has been really supportive in all the actions that APISA has taken, and also the president's board, the president board, Richard Fukutaki. And I would just like to take a moment and thank everyone for all their support. And I would like to also say that a lot of the actions, as the remembrance ceremony that you were present at, it's a part of a very united and cohesive staff members that we have in Bellevue, API staff members, Non Ma, Leslie Lum, Pavi Tao, Belly Nishioka, and Nora Lance. And they're always in every single action, like almost every single day, taking actions to promote API matters and to keep these discussions going. And from my understanding, like the current president has been supportive in those actions. That's
Sure.
the best of my knowledge. So I would like to thank them.
Yeah. Yeah, and I had a conversation with her as well, and yeah, it was totally a message of support, and I think that they're 100% with us on this. So I mean, they've given us the room to do this, and I think it's fantastic.
And also, like, I would like to once again thank Tonya Estes for supporting us, and from Faculty Commons, so making this possible and opening the space for us to do this also. Before we take any other questions, I would just want to share like a few extra slides about future events that we're having. So as you mentioned, like Tule Lake, we have a movie that we're gonna air to all our students and staff members if you want. It's called Resistance at Tule Lake. So, and this is only for students. You go, after you watch the movie, you answer 6 true or false questions, and then you get a bubble tea. So we're doing bubble tea for knowledge, and that's an opportunity to learn a little bit more what happened in Tule Lake that was mentioned. And also, the artist that drew these images of Never Again Is Now, she's a Bellevue College student. Her name is Helen Wren Avancina. And she's gonna, if you want to, you can send a picture to a PISA coordinator at bellevuecollege.edu, and Ren is gonna just make a profile picture of you or design you in an anime manga style if you want. So
Those are great. I myself like the 3-breasted alien, but
okay, do we have any more questions? Well, I think not.
well, I look
I'm
at.
sorry. Yeah, there's one more, if you
Oh,
don't
great.
mind, David. Yeah.
Yeah, not at all.
Thank you. I was wondering the names of all of the different families that were part of the farming industry in Bellevue during the early, I'm sorry, I'm bad with dates, 1920s until they were put in the internment camps. Is there a list or is there a map as well that I can see what that used to look like?
Yeah, so I think so. I did a Twitter thread on this thing. There was like 120 tweets. And somewhere in that Twitter, if you go to Twitter and you look at my name, which is at David Neiwert, Neiwert, and go and if you go to my profile and click on the thread of threads that I have at the pinned to the top of my profile, you'll be able to find that. Go into that thread of threads, and you can find the thread I did on Miller Freeman. And in that thread, I have a map of Bellevue at the time. We produced a map for the original Journal American series, but I don't think the publisher included it in Strawberry Days. And that map really was just an adaptation of a map that I had found in an old book written by an Issei gentleman who was describing the early Bellevue community. And that book is available. You can get it down at the Historical Society. Let me see here real quick.
I have a map that you sent me, David.
Do you? Oh, okay. Well,
yeah,
then great. If you could share that with folks, that'd be great. Because that's that map. That's the map. So,
yeah, so
there you go. Oh yeah, that's the one I scribbled on. So yes, there I am, and it's got the that one notes the names of the families that owned those farms. So and yes, the Peterson Hill tract, as you can see, was a very large. It's now the Bellevue Country Club, but that had about 10 families living on it. So.
Okay, cool. I'm going to take a moment to get that map, and I want to be able to cite it, so
Well,
I
drop
don't
me
think I'll be able to.
you can drop me a note at my email. It's just my name, david.neiwert, Neiwert @gmail.com. And I'll be glad to send you, I can send you both copies, one that's clean and one that's scribbled on if you want.
Okay. I got your name spelled wrong for a second.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
David Neiwert, and the email is what was your email? I'm sorry.
It's just my name, david.neiwert @gmail.com.
David. Okay. Very good. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, and of course, Strawberry Days has a full list of all the folks I interviewed in it. There were, I think, close to 30. So, but and you know, it was. Yeah, I just feel I have to say before I sign off that I personally am I remain deeply grateful to all of these folks that I interviewed for letting me tell their story. I'm just a white dude from Idaho, but I actually grew up near Twin Falls, and I was a bird dog. My dad would use me as a bird dog when I was a little kid when we'd go pheasant hunting. And we used to go pheasant hunting at the Minidoka camp. So I knew what it looked like back in the early 60s. So it wasn't much there. There was the only thing that was still there when I was a kid was the lava rock, or the chimney made of lava rock that was still standing. And I think it's still there today, but they've reconstructed everything now. But when I was there, it was just basically empty landscape.
Okay, thank you so much. And I wanted to thank you for all this work that you've done. And it's really amazing, all of the insight you've gathered in the past. And it's really important going forward that, like you said, we face it with integrity and forthrightedness.
Yeah, I mean, I want to leave the world a better place for my kid. You know, I have a child who's about to turn 19, and right now I didn't do a very good job of making the world a better place is all I could say. But you know, that's what this is always about, is trying to make the world a better place for all of us. I really do believe a rising tide lifts all boats, and I think we all benefit when we help those who are disadvantaged, those who have been crushed under the system that we've created. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, it's almost 3 o'clock, so I think that we
Well,
can
I guess
end it.
I guess
Yeah.
we've run out of time. Hey, I really appreciate, I mean, we had what, 116 people today, something like that?
Even more. We had almost 100 and I think like 30 or 40 at a time.
Wow. So yeah, that's so cool. And I really, really appreciate having the chance to talk to that many people. And I really appreciate everybody taking the time to tune in. I hope you all learned something.
Oh, I know that we learned a lot. And thank you so much, David. This has been really great. And thank you for rescheduling so many times. And,
Oh yeah.
and still
I just
being
wish we
restored.
could have done it on the campus, but
Yeah.
times are what they are.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
Great
Well,
work.
thank
Thank you, David.
Yes, my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you everyone who watched this, who took a moment from this beautiful afternoon to be here with us. And I'm really grateful that you were all here. And I hope that you guys can make it for next Friday with Lu Wong Ung who's going to talk to us a little bit about resilience. And I think it's something that we all need in this times with such uncertainties and so many things happening. And to have a survivor come and give us an uplift talk, because that's what she's going to do. She's not going to depress or anything. She's going to bring us and uplift our spirits.
That's awesome.
Thank you so much. And watch Resistance at Tule Lake. There's a link that we're going to put on Apisa's website. If anybody has any questions and wants to add more to this conversation, feel free to contact us at apisa.coordinator@bellevuecollege.edu. And just send any questions or any other information that you want. Thank you, David. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
very much.